Greetings, and welcome to Chapter 17. I'm Professor Trevor Miller, and I'm going to guide you through this lecture. Today we're going to be focusing on the westward expansion and what that meant to the Native American tribes that were already in the area. So for today's lecture, we're going to be covering the Native American tribes and the westward expansion, and we're going to be covering the conditions that led to the Great Expansion. Before we can get there, though, we're going to talk a little bit about how the course is set up in your weekly assignments for this week. For a typical week, you'll have 2 chapters to read out of the textbook, and that means you'll have 2 learning curve assignments associated with those. Now, those learning curve assignments are a self-paced quiz that you take online through Canvas. You can keep taking those learning curves over and over and over again until you get the score you want. Also, we have a discussion board that's due each week. The initial post is due by Thursday each week, and at least one reply to another student is due on Sunday. So here are the assignments for week 1. You're required to read chapter 17 and 18. You are required to complete the learning curve assessments associated with those. Now, this week's discussion boards are a little heavier than a normal week. This week you have an introduction post, a welcome post, which is due by Thursday. You have a plagiarism statement that basically says, hey, I'm not going to plagiarize in this course. That too is due on Thursday. You have your first week's discussion post about the material, which is due on Thursday, and a reply to at least one other student by Sunday. Each week you'll have a writing assignment. This week your writing assignment, again, is 1 to 2 pages based off the reading and material of the week. It is due on Sunday. That is turned in through Canvas. And you have what is a little heavier than a normal week. You have the historical modules. This week you have modules 1 through 4. Those are due on Sunday. All 7 of the historical modules have to be complete before you can access week 3's lessons, lectures, or assignments. As we start our first lesson, I would ask you to keep these things in mind and keep these things in mind throughout the course. History is one of those subjects that people usually love or they hate, and I'm not going to throw all kinds of dates and expect you to remember critical dates and this happened when and blah, blah, blah. I'm more interested in the people. If you can understand the people of the era, you'll have a better understanding of history. If you can understand their ideas, their beliefs, you will have a better understanding of why they did the things they did. Also, keep in mind their relationships. The relationships are interconnected. So the relationships between the people and the ideas, the relationships between other individuals, right? Again, understanding those things will help you better understand what really occurred. And then the motives. And this is one of those really important areas. So if you can understand the reason why someone did something, to me, that's more important than remembering an arbitrary date. All of these ideas are interconnected, and please keep them in the forefront of your mind as we study all of the lessons associated with this course. So by the end of this week's first 2 lessons, you should be able to answer all of these questions. Also, these lessons are there to complement, not replace, your reading material out of the textbook or learning curve assignments. So please make sure you are reading and paying attention to the videos and or lessons each week. Now, as we get started here, you might be thinking to yourself, gee, this slide says the Civil War ended in 1865, which is absolutely correct. However, the Gilded Age, right, this course technically doesn't begin until 1877. However, the conditions that occurred at the end of Reconstruction impacted the way the Gilded Age unfolded. So to understand one, you have to understand what came before it. We're going to cover that quite briefly. So as the Civil War comes to an end, we enter a period of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, by and large, didn't really work. There was no clear vision of how to unite the country and how to readdress the economy after the war. So the war ended, the South is completely decimated. That's every aspect of Southern life is decimated. The economy is crumbling, and the North begins to rebuild. And as the North rebuilds, its focus is less agrarian and more on industry. Now that's enticing. That's enticing to a lot of people. So as Reconstruction collapsed, right, we have to examine the reasons why Reconstruction collapsed. And part of that's because of failures of political will, people's political motives, and systemic racism. Those things combined inhibited the growth of the South during this time period and encouraged people or enticed people to leave the South. There was mass migration as well of former slaves. They now had an option to leave the area that they lived for the first time in their lives. So many traveled to the north, different urban areas, and throughout the West. Now, another contributing factor to this movement of people, right, is what we're focusing on here, is the availability of land. So as the Civil War wraps up, the nation's focus has shifted from strife to westward expansion, and part of that is go westward, right, and claim land and make your fortune. And many of immigrants, many lower class whites, many former slaves, this was enticing to them, and that's the direction that they headed. Now, as these folks migrated west, right, each had a different target in mind of where they wanted to end up. However, these were the major routes and thoroughfares to get from one point to another. Most famously, of course, is the Oregon Trail, right? There's the Santa Fe Trail, there's the Old Spanish Trail. All of these routes were common ways for people to go west. Now, along their journey, they were faced with strife of all types, that being from disease, from animals, and the inhabitants of those regions, the Native Americans. So as Americans migrated west, they frequently encountered Native Americans, and sometimes things were peaceful and sometimes they weren't. Now I found this slide interesting. This is a graphic. This is a graphic that takes the viewer through the historical background of native lands and how the native lands were impacted by westward expansion of Europeans, then colonists, then Americans. And you can see by the end of the presentation here, Native Americans were largely reduced to minor pockets of land that were frequently not of great quality. As Americans moved west, they frequently encountered Native Americans of different tribes, and things were hostile often. So, to help curb these hostilities, the United States sent representatives to 16 Native nations throughout the Midwest and West and offered to sign a treaty. 13 of those tribes attended Fort Laramie, and they signed the Horse Creek Treaty of 1851. Now, this must have been a sight to see because of outside of Fort Laramie in Wyoming, there were somewhere around 10,000 Native Americans from all different tribes. Now, the goals of this treaty are pretty interesting. The whole idea was to create peace between all nations. The United States wanted access through native lands to build roads and railroads through those areas. Now, that's a big thing. Think about the land that was already there. To build roads and railroads, the United States is going to have to travel across native lands and disrupt the habitats that are already there. Furthermore, part of the objectives here were to create a commission, right? That it would help protect Native Americans from miners, from pioneers, from fur trappers, from people that were in that area that did negative things to the Native American lands and the Native Americans that were there. It also required that native tribes make restitutions for reprisals. So oftentimes when there was an issue that would take place, a hostile act, one group would attack another in reprisal. This made that the Native Americans would have to pay for those reprisals. It established traditional boundaries for tribes so that they were designated within certain regions of the country. And the idea here was that when the chiefs signed this and the American representatives signed this, this was bound forever. They were going to be held to account forever for future generations. Now, also, what was interesting here is that as long as this treaty was good, each Native American tribe, each tribe that signed, would get a sum of $50,000 for the sum of 10 years. Now, that is a ton of money in this time period. Now, what's interesting as well is that should any one of the tribes, any one of the 13 tribes that signed, the treaty was void for every tribe. Now, think about that. If you've got 13 neighbors and all 13 of them agree to a certain code, and then one of them doesn't behave the correct way, or something happens that's out of their control, all of the rest of you suffer the consequences of that. So there are positives and there are negatives of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Again, very interesting, and interesting what comes out of this treaty. So just a few years later, we have gold that's found in the Dakota Territory. Colonel George Custer, Civil War hero, right? His troops found gold in French Creek, and this sparked a mass movement of Americans to the area. Just a few years later, right, there's about 10,000 miners in Custer, Rapid City area, Deadwood, Hill City, all throughout that region, all looking for gold. So this means that the United States broke its promise to the Native American tribes, because part of that treaty was to designate that the Americans would control, the American government would control Americans from violating native lands. So the American government found that it couldn't control the miners and settlers that were in the area. There were just too many. The greed was too much for some people. So miners were all over the mountains and hills of the Dakota Territory, upsetting the native tribes because they, in good faith, had signed an accord saying that the government would control its people. Atrocities occurred. There were attacks on both sides. There was violence on both sides. Railroads were starting to expand through the area, right? The governor of the Dakota Territory attempted to buy, or excuse me, the government attempted to buy the land from the Native Americans outside of the treaty, and of course that didn't work. By 1867, Deadwood itself, the town of Deadwood, had about 5,000 residents that were American residents. And there were about 5,000 others out in the hills panning for gold and those types of things. The Lakota and the Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, refused to sell the land, right? And it created a war. Crazy Horse was one of the leaders of that war against the United States. And he was later killed, and General Custer was later killed, and afterwards Congress annexed the land of the Black Hills, regardless of the previous treaty. Now, there were dozens upon dozens of native tribes throughout the West, and I just highlighted this one as an example to show you how Americans traveled through the region looking for properties, looking for minerals, looking for products that they could mine and sell, regardless of what the government said, regardless of what the restrictions were. Americans were going to take the land regardless. Now, this cycle is repeated over and over and over again throughout the West. If you're any student of Western history, you understand how widespread this issue was, and there's atrocities throughout the West until natives are eventually pushed on to reservations throughout the West. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. Again, I want to welcome you to the course. We talked about the average workload of a week. We talked about this week's assignments and their deadlines and how this week is just a little bit heavier than other weeks. And then we talked about the West, the contested West, and the conditions that led to American westward expansion. I hope you enjoy the course. I hope you get a lot out of it. Again, this material is to be supplemented with your weekly reading, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.